One of the explanations is that the timeline was threatened by these temporal distortions that resulted in operations involving temporal dislocation, transportation, or translocation, or relocation. And this is viewing as well as actual translocation. And so, as a result, there were changes which influenced our history. And so, our history, our timeline began to take on a convoluted effect. And this basically meant that events of history were changing, and as a result, the far future was becoming something different. And so, what was discovered is that when looking back to the past, there were events that were observed, and basically these events were replicated on a quantum level, meaning an entire scenario was mapped out with props and cloned, if you will, replicants inside of a time bubble, and this was anchored in to the timeline using advanced technology managed by these beings that were capable of doing so. And these artificial events were anchored in, and thus we were anchored to them in the timeline that we are on now. And so, or at least we were on then. And so these were viewed, and at first it was believed that these were real events, when upon traveling to these times, it was discovered that these entire events, the literal location, was basically a movie set. It was a four-dimensional movie set. Everyone there was basically running a kind of script, and all the events, all the objects were props. They were literally atomically or molecularly replicated and put into place, and the actual location was inside of a time bubble, basically a distortion bubble, a field, and it wasn't actually within a universe, at least the original universe. It was basically held in a temporal dimension. There's a word, it's called an artificial dimension, which is pretty much, you could view your computer and the desktop and operating system that's on there as an artificial environment. Say you go in and program your computer or program an operating system, you've essentially created an artificial environment. And so now the allegory, or maybe the example, is a parallel. It's the exact same. These beings have the ability to program matter, and from that to create a distortion field and have their own space, their own environment, which is as if it's their own computing environment. And from there they use the replicating abilities to program matter, and then they basically code an entire environment, an entire scene. And so this has been done throughout our history. Upon going back and actually, once we developed the technology to not just view back in time, but to transport materials and personnel, we actually interacted with these environments. And it is like the Chuck E. Cheese robots that kind of turn and make a few specific motions, and then that's all they can do. That was literally what these events were like. Certain scenarios, assassinations, key events in history, assassinations, disasters, discoveries, certain events like these were entirely fabricated. And when going back to interact with the scene, it was like playing a simple video game environment over and over again. There was no malleability, there was no genuine variability to the environment. So there was no variability to the environment. It was just like a video game when, in the movie, what was it called? Existence. That was the simulation, a virtual reality movie, a video game. It was like in that video game environment when the person didn't say the right thing to get to the next level of the game, the people around them would just kind of go blank-minded, and when the person tried to interact with them again, that person, the computer person basically, would repeat the same last sentence that they said before until that player, the real player person, would come up with the right response. And so that's kind of how these environments responded. It was literally a pre-programmed 3.5 dimensional bubble universe, a bubbleverse, that was being created by these entities that were doing one of two things. And that was the main idea, that we can come down to what was going on, to determining that, the details. But now the question of why, how, we've gotten to. And so the how is, when our technology got to that point, from having scientists go in and out of our own distortion fields for years at a time, to develop all that can be developed technologically and then continue the process, we accelerated very quickly technologically. And so when our technology got up to the speed where we could recreate events had we wanted to, we understood how they were doing this. We understood what was happening, and we understood how. The why, the overall results, and how it related to them, what we meant to them, that was more confusing, and it's pretty difficult even to explain. So these entities were anchoring the timeline in, and there's one of two reasons. Either this is to replace the present through the introduction of these artificial pasts, these artificial past events, or, well, in order to do that, and then in order to create a future which is desirable to them, i.e. it leads up to somehow or another the creation, proliferation, or sustaining of their species. And so somehow they either convert us or take over and inhabit the society or build a temporal bridge, and they could be parallel, basically. Maybe meaning they don't have, this is not being done for the future production of themselves in some way or another, and at that point it's a completely different reason. And so as part of that explanation, this could be that as a result of these operations, timeline was distorted and convoluted and couldn't exist in the way that it was previously, the organic version, or, without collapsing. And so as a result of the distortions, instead of collapsing or after collapsing or at the point of collapsing, these beings, these entities who are capable of moving in and out of time or across the dimensional barriers, moved in and began stitching the timeline together using these artificially generated environments and events, and through that, sustaining our time to the point where a collapse wouldn't be the result of the distortions. And it's a really weird story of how all this came about, and how, how we got to this point. Basically involves a lot of operations and operatives seeing these beings in action, trying to reverse what they're doing, then experiencing these beings reversing or countering our attempts to reverse what they were doing, and all the while assuming that they must be maliciously motivated, and yet being unable to really gain the upper hand, and not really understanding how. And there's a whole bunch of weird stuff and confusion that results, such as another faction recreating the biology of these beings to use as their own, essentially, military force, interdimensional military force, which then has the capacity for psychotronic warfare weaponry built into their biology. And so that obviously made things a lot more difficult and unfavorable for those trying to understand and mediate the situation. And there's a whole host of stuff from there, from weaponry to reverse engineered weaponry to attacks and counterattacks to espionage to cloning human entities that were then guided by these beings, to then these beings being reverse engineered and then being controlled by humans. And it was basically just a kind of interdimensional war or chess game that went on from the beginning of civilization. Because once one epoch, if you will, or more so layer of history is kind of riddled with these distortions, the only place to go is further back. And so it went, and it went, and it went until it reached the beginning. And thus, we have the convoluted creation of how things got to be the way they are today, which is confusing, but it's kind of how these paradox scenarios work out, that what we basically have always experienced turn out to be quote-unquote new events inserted into time as a result of operations and changes that occurred halfway through what we consider to be the whole timeline. But because of the way time works, everyone's perception sees these events and sees this timeline as simply being the way things always were. There's no retrocausality that changes anything. It's just the way this universe always was. Now, there are a few specific individuals, operatives, that come, or at least have been to, and some come from the original timelines. And they hold the knowledge of how things were, meaning before the time wars, if you will. And we would call these some other kind of being because they're human, but they would be the unadulterated, non-genetically modified, non-mind controlled, basically non-bred for stupidity versions of humans. So they're liberated. and they've played a part in everything that's been going on. In the same sense, there's the other side that's more or less been playing the opposite role with the same level of intensity. And so it's kind of confusing. I know I probably confused a lot of people that listen to this. Hopefully the last ones haven't been too confusing. Ask questions. The last one was probably one of the most confusing, and I think I got the most questions out of that, which is still not too much, but I'm going to base everything off of what people are looking at and thinking and feeding back based upon what I'm giving them. And that way there's this kind of multiple conversation that's taking place between what I'm presenting and the public. And that's probably going to be one of the easiest ways to go about refining the information in a way that will be understandable. However, it's never easy. Going through and being shown these events and seeing them and being there while it happened, you know, in Operation Younger, it's not any easier understanding. I mean, it is, because it's right in front of your eyes, and you know for instance, the weapons that are used, or the resistance and the confusion because it's being done to you, but it's blatantly being done. Whereas the same thing's happening here, it's just behind the scenes. So there are entities that alter time as the human teams were going around more or less unwittingly distorting time, and some of these operations seem to be by entities that were healing the timeline, and others were basically these designed beings that match ancient descriptions of these types of controller entities, maybe demiurgic entities, and they were creating further distortions or mapping out the convoluted timeline to basically create a completely like a prison timeline. And so this is part of the time war and the time wars, but it's really just one time war. I mean, really, what does it mean if there are multiple? If it's regarding time itself, well, there can only be one, because it's throughout time. It's inherent, it's a given, because it's a time war. And so time war basically ends, and another one would begin to make time wars once people are liberated from the first one. Therefore, the war ends. And once it ends, it's not going to start up again. So there's really only one, and it's ending now, because we're at a threshold now, because no more can be changed without destroying the whole thing. So the only other option is for people to realize what's been going on and make a decision from there. And that's pretty much the basis of it. The basis of this talk is that when the old self is allowed to die, or only when the old self is allowed to die, then the new self can be born, and it can be born free from the afflictions that constrained the old. So, a few things come to mind here, or should come to mind, or maybe just come to my mind, what we can call my mind, but it's really just as much your mind as it is mine. And so, this isn't really a matter of life and death, although when we don't go through this process, when we don't embody this freedom of mind, spirit, and emotion, eventually we develop stress and dis-ease from the inability to change and cope with the environment, and that can result in physical death, which is still just an illusion anyway. So some things that could come to mind are how certain people that will constrain our personality from being who we think we should be, or who we think we really are, and how this can have a restrictive effect, obviously, because it's constraining us, but this can also have an illusory effect, or even a secondarily constrictive effect, to the point where when we permit that we can be conditioned to believe that this constrained version is who we really are, or that the cycles of feeling constrained and then coping with it in manners other than true self-expression, or expression of the true self, that become a routine, that become part of our our personality, part of the way we handle other stressors, and in that way it grows basically onto us. The restriction, the restrictive aspect, the contorted belief systems, like an intoxication or a toxification of our own self-image from the way others may feel, that becomes embedded in the way the mind processes information and experience, and we automatically begin to lose sight of or overlook, as if it's an illusion, as if it becomes invisible almost, the original nature of how we feel and how we behave, and even the joy that comes from natural behavior, that comes from the mind, the emotions, without distortions, without unnatural inhibitions, and how that ultimately drains us of our energy. And in being drained, that is where the disease and stress comes from. And that drainage comes from the extra emotional, mental, and physical energy required to put up with this restrictive resistance against what is otherwise naturally flowing expression and self-image. And therefore, it is the resistance, basically the resisting of the resistance. And even after that, if a person doesn't realize what has happened, then when that is basically entered into their personality, the propping up of this false persona requires much more energy than does, say, simply feeling and being and expressing the self without these false paradigms and interjected constructs for behavior and mental patterning that then overlays a personality for one's life. And so the main idea here is that a person can be unwittingly brought into this type of relationship, pulled in. Basically, the type of individuals who will bring these effects on a person, they're not the types of individuals that will let you know what they're doing before they do it. It's basically a form of parasitism, deception, and in a way, a type of, it's like a cleverly, it's like a distortion. I don't want to use the word scam, but it's the same concept, just in energetic terms. I'd say it's an illusion, a deception, or there's a better term than scam. It's basically a person is kind of sociopathic in nature to do these things, and when that individual they contain these they contain the results, the effects of such parasitic behavior or interference in their life, and so then it sheds off, it influences and threatens the stability of another individual. So it operates like a virus, like a mind virus. The individual doesn't have to know what they're doing. It's a result of instability to the point where they can simply be following unconscious orders, if you will, unconscious paradigms regarding society, social moralism or social morality and moral relativism, where we define what's acceptable and what's not based upon what others around us define that as, or their behavior or the higher authority. And so people who fall prey to that may not realize what they're doing and what's happening to them. However, the effects are the same, and that is basically the original self, the original processing of emotions and thought processes or mental processes. They get overlaid. They are overlaid by these external constructs, and they're externally introduced, pretty much similar to using a USB drive to introduce a virus to a computer system, and then it distorts the original information. Just like a body, it reconstructs parts of the personality to enable the reproduction of that same patterning, which isn't original to the whole, and then it utilizes the original connections, relationships, desires, or assets to then reproduce and share or spread that viral load to others that are influentially proximal to that infected system. And so, of course, eventually, when the virus runs its course, the host is either very weakened or dies completely. And so that's what we're witnessing in society now, as a type of confusion, a deceptive behavior. So to conclude this, we're basically in a time where people are realizing there is this kind of mass parasitism effect in society, and there has been a weakening. People aren't really in the best situation. However, once we get over this process, we begin to understand the information that was being kept to us, the knowledge and the empathy and the power in that. And through this, we return to power. And so there's a lot that is taking place as far as these old systems crumbling, kind of like sand in between people's fingers, because these systems aren't designed to support truth and to promote self-awareness. They're designed to more or less serve a purpose that keeps a select group of people in power, and that's no longer feasible in the given power structure, where those people will either get out of control and the power that is being handled is handled in a way that's unsustainable and can't happen, or people are quick enough mentally to realize what's happening and take steps to pretty much try and return to the power automatically or under their own accord. And so we're watching this happen in society as we speak, and we're kind of watching it, like I've said before, as it's the same as an addict going through withdrawal, where the people will cling to their wound, their emotional scar, their parasitic responses. They'll cling to those behaviors, those patterns, and they won't want to admit that there's a problem. And those who are entirely entrenched in this parasitic behavior, these so-called sociopaths, they are more afraid of being discovered than they are of losing their great power. However, because of the nature of the addiction, they don't have the power, if you will, to disable that addiction, but that's also, in a way, not fair, because there are these power systems where everyone is basically controlled and kept an eye on. They keep an eye on each other because it's serving a larger purpose of feeding power through these organizations, and so then they become kind of like a dysfunctional maybe hierarchy where they start to turn on each other before they start to sort out their own issues and kind of integrate into a larger system, or maybe begin to heal, because they're willing to sacrifice one another, at least in the fundamental core of that system, willing to sacrifice one another instead of coming to light of this truth and basically helping the world heal and helping themselves heal. But the idea behind that is that the more that goes on, the more suffering there will be for everyone, because there is no real way out of that. What they're hiding from is the release of technology that allows people to look into time and to go back and basically finalize what began, or what begins in a few years from now, which is basically the time war, excuse me. Because at that point, everything begins anew and we finalize the whole occurrence. But the whole point is that we've been going through it because it has not happened yet, because they've been doing everything they can using this technology to prevent it from starting. Because once it starts, it's basically over. Very confusing, but that's what's going on. And the idea is once this information is out, people are no longer able to be tricked. The whole system is seen for what it is. It's a power inequality, kind of like the wealth inequality. And once people are given access to technologies as well as knowledge, they can literally shield themselves through time, and it kind of works as a retrocausality as far as affecting or influencing the past, which is how this whole society is entangled or convoluted in this type of false paradigm or matrix reality construct where the flow of history is more or less artificial or deceptive. And so the idea is once the same tools and methods are used to heal, that changes these occurrences in history, and they know that, and so they're kind of like living it up while they can. And there is a whole host of understanding about whether that's the end of days, when they finally give up the show, they're actually going to basically end the world, or however that's going to work out. There's a whole bunch of theories and understandings, but the point is that when the information comes out, the people return to power, and they have the ability to correct the disturbances in time and space and consciousness, and this is actually the deconstruction of that false paradigm, or the false light matrix system, what's called the false light matrix. And just to clarify again, there's only one real retrocausal effect, which is when something can actually change in the past, and that's when the whole thing, everything, is returned to the way it was before they began playing with technology. There's one retrocausal effect, there's one change, there's one time that it happens, and once it does, it's done forever. Don't let others define who you are based upon their limitations of their knowledge of the self, of the universe, or of consciousness. Also, you can move past that, but also, don't accept their limitations, even for themselves. If they want to interact with you, interact in a way where they are required to apply themselves to make use and make sense of the possibilities, rather than ignoring or downplaying reality, because the truth is that no one really knows what's going on entirely, let alone those who are challenged simply by the experiences of another. And more specifically, no one knows what's going on entirely unless that person decides for themselves, okay, without relying on another, involving themselves with another, or denying another. Each person decides for themselves. That person who has decided for themselves, that person knows what's going on in reality. This talk is about the liberation of the mind from the perceptual illusions that are born out of the belief systems that are inherent to a conformist society, and the familiarity that develops, and from that familiarity, the fear of the unknown, which becomes a limitation or restriction that must be overcome in order to truly express the self and to avoid manipulation, which replaces our intentions with a preconceived set of notions or expectations which we are required to adhere to in order to consider ourselves acceptable, successful, or healthy. People are afraid to let go of their illusions. People are afraid to let go of that which holds them back. They feel, or honestly they believe, and then they produce the maybe pseudo-intention or pseudo-feeling, the perception, that if they don't hold on to those limiting belief systems or those structural components of their mind which they've conformed to and are familiar with, like the bars of a prison cell to a prisoner, they feel fear. They fear that they will experience suffering. It is the fear of the unknown. It is the fear of the loss of structure. And is basically the falsely perceived fear of the destruction of their world. That is what fear means, that is what the letting go of anxieties, worries, requirements of a externally produced or instructed belief system. That is what that equates to, though. The loss of the known, and therefore the end of all that is familiar, and in that way the world. However, in that person's mind, the mind of the one who is a prisoner to their own mind, all that is familiar is the prison, and the structure of an imprisoned experience or perspective. And so to let go of those perspectives is unfamiliar and therefore fear-inducing. This is somewhat like an individual who, they feel that they have to perform in a certain way for others, and that they must complete this whatever in order to produce a result in life that is acceptable to those around them in whatever relationship, or format that's going to appear in. And so trying to convince such a person to let that go and find what they really want, in trying to convince that person to do that, one will be met with all kinds of excuses, such as how they will be letting another person down, basically this false authority. They will be letting themselves down. They will not have a purpose. They could lose their mind, their reputation, etc., so on and so forth. And all these aspects, all these excuses, are only applicable to the prisoner in the prison. That's all they are. Outside the prison, they mean nothing. And so then it says, well, another example, a way to look at it is that somebody who feels that they are bettering themselves or protecting themselves and another, maybe that individual, that's being they're conforming to somebody else's expectation. Well, the person bringing those expectations, they're in the same boat. They might sit there and believe that they must enforce their son or daughter to become a this or that, basically to conform to their view, because they believe their view is connected with the larger aspect of society and the world, and that's where success will be born. The idea of success is not born through that external process, but through what's found within, through the unveiling of the soul, and the true purpose, cosmic purpose, self-awareness, finding the self, selfhood. But they might believe that if they let go, and they basically more or less stop harassing that individual and feeling harassed themselves by the creativity of a person, or by the possibilities, or by the conformist system itself, that all the bad things, all the undesirable probabilities will surely come about. And that the self-awareness that could be found through that wouldn't be worth the risk of not succeeding in a conformist society or world. And so the idea then is if that person, the individual that they are putting their expectations on, wakes up in a way and comes forward with the idea that they no longer want to have those expectations put on them, they don't want to conform, and that they know they can do it on themselves, that person with the expectations trying to have the other person, basically the parent, trying to have their son or daughter conform, they will respond with fear. and they will try to instill in that son or daughter that they don't know the truth, that they don't know the right way to find themselves, to be who they really are, and that they must conform because the parent is correct in their expectations, in their specific outline of what is required of the child, and that if the child is being successful in a way that goes outside of that parent's expectations, or is maybe not directly aligned with it, but it is successful, it is honest and safe and harmonious, they wouldn't know how to react. They would be frightened. Now, if it turns out okay, they would understand. But the point is, up until that point, or up until that completion, that realization of success, they would be afraid. They would think the worst is happening. They would literally resist that child's success, resist their freedom of creativity, their likelihood of finding themselves under the guise of doing what's right. And as they see them go to attempt that success, to attain it, they would literally feel frightened. But once the child follows through, they would be put to ease, and they would know that the child is capable, and that freedom of expression is simply how that's supposed to work. But up until that point, there would be the illusion, the perception connected to that belief system, generating that false authority, and generated by that false authority, leading into these perceptual imbalances, that could never be the right decision, and that could undoubtedly be a bad choice and result in suffering, fear, and failure. And so that's the situation we're in the world, where the people who are providing these expectations, these ideals, these belief system structures, expecting others to conform, they are frightened of what's going to happen if people don't conform. Now, this is not in a negative manner. Anarchy could be negative, which is the false illusion, the false interpretation, where anarchy is self-guidance, self-governance. And so, if they allow that fear to govern them, they fall in line with the illusion, and conformity becomes pleasant, a comfortable lie in the face of frightful self-control, self-governance, freedom, and creativity, ultimately self-awareness, because you have to know the self to guide the self. And if you don't know the self, that's pretty frightening, is it not? But of course, you can't not know the self, because you are the self. It would be like a light not emitting light as long as it works properly. But as long as you're here, as you see sunlight, as you see colors, you feel the weight of your body, the pull of the universe. Okay, well, that's you. You're feeling you. The self-knowledge is in motion. You don't really have to do anything. It's just that we're in this entanglement of more or less absolute insecurity and lack of belief in the self that generates these perceptions, these perceptual illusions, that by not conforming to what is undoubtedly a dying system that doesn't actually give people what they want, that by not conforming to that, we're going to somehow create more suffering instead of reducing it. That we're going to somehow lose ourselves instead of finding ourselves. And so, it's very simple. We just have to get over that fear, get over that tendency, social programming. There's a psychological term for it, that social tendency to conform. And once we overcome that, we are free to choose. But as well, those who witness us performing that, they will be frightened by our freedom, by our liberation. And this is kind of like crabs. This is kind of like the crab. There's no psychological term. The crabs in the bucket, where the people hold one another back, literally like crabs in a bucket, if you've ever seen that, where if one crab begins to escape, the other ones latch on them and hold them down. And it looks like a big joke, because instead of one of them escaping, the autonomous reaction of the others hold everyone down. And that's what happens in society. And so, like everything else in society, people are entangled, twisted like fabric, resulting in a knot of the mind, of intentions, and belief that must be undone, untangled before we can truly interact without moving through these contrived systems which are essentially filtering our true potential. And again, fear is what enables that. Fear of the unknown, fear of liberation, fear of the self, and of breaking free from a conformist view and entering into self-governance. That is what enables the process of mind entrainment, where the person lives as a prisoner of their own mind. And it's not just society that does this. It's basically something that's a part of our biology that could have been entered into society, that could have been entered into DNA. However that came about, that's what the situation is. Whether it was started in this society, or whether it is a natural aspect of biology in this world or the universe, regardless of the cause, that is the situation we're in. And the answer is to consciously, personally, literally, through an application of our own free will and intent, or our willpower, to overcome it. That is the answer. the answer to the restriction of the mind through fear, and the false constructs of these belief systems turned into perceptual limitations of our self-awareness and basically the honesty that comes with that, and ultimately our compassion and our knowledge, and eventually, literally ultimately again, that each wraps around another, our free will, our ability to express our own free will.